Now let's turn our focus to the widening deficit. The U.S. budget deficit reached a record for the first 10 months of the fiscal year as the government increased spending to help boost the economy. Actually spent the most money that we ever have in any month in U.S. history. Jared Bernstein is the chief economist and economic policy advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, and he joins me now from the White House. Jared, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Matt.
Let me start by asking you, we heard President Obama say a while back that his goal was to halve or cut in half the deficit by the end of his first term. Are you still headed for that?
Yes, we are. We're going to obviously ramp down spending significantly, especially when you consider the Recovery Act. I think the Recovery Act, if we're going to have any discussion about deficits, has to be at the heart of the discussion. Because when we got here, Matt, there were two things that met us at the door. A huge $1.3 trillion, very troubling budget deficit, but an economy that was headed off the cliff into free fall. Now, if we had reacted at that time on the deficit side by raising taxes or cutting spending, we would have ensured that that economy didn't just head for the cliff, but flew off. So we had to engage in temporary deficit spending to stimulate this economy, to help it, and I'm going to use the Fed's words right now from today's release, to help the economic cycle level off. And I think our plans are taking hold. I think that's very much a positive, both in terms of the stimulus working through the system and the economy getting back on track so that we can cut that spending and get the deficit back down as a share of the economy.
All right, but, Jared, obviously spending is only half of the equation here. In the month of July, spending did rise 26%, but revenue fell 6%, and the Recovery Act isn't going to help necessarily to boost revenue. How do you expect to do that? Are you going to raise taxes?
Well, I disagree with your premise. And first of all, the answer of taxes, the answer is, of course, no. The Recovery Act significantly lowered taxes for 95% of working families through the Making Work Pay tax cut. But let me make a very important and clear point here. The Recovery Act was responsible, according to outside economists. This is not our estimate. This is Goldman Sachs. This is Mark Zandi. This is Paul Krugman. It's the economic policy. The consensus is that the Recovery Act added 2 to 3 percentage points to GDP in the second quarter. Remember, GDP was contracting at a rate faster than 6% in the first quarter, 1% in the second quarter. When you add 2 to 3% to GDP, as the Recovery Act has done in the views of these economists, you also add revenue to the economy. Now, I'm not saying, I agree with you that revenue is down. It's a recession, of course it is. But it would have been down a lot more had the Recovery Act not helped to stabilize the free fall that we were discussing a second ago. GDP growth in and of itself helps you restore some of your revenue loss.
All right, but of course the Recovery Act isn't the only thing the president has on his plate here. Health care is going to cost a lot of money, cap and trade. There are a lot of important policies to this administration. Will you be able to carry these policies out without raising taxes?
First of all, let's be very clear. The president's health care plan is fully paid for. And some of that does involve revenue increases on families with incomes above $250,000. That's something we've been very clear about ever since we released our FY10 budget. Now, I think it's really germane for you to raise health care in the context of deficits and debt. Let me quote Peter Orszag. We do not get to a level of sustainable deficits, of sustainable debt, without reforming health care. The path towards fiscal responsibility goes through health care reform. So I think it's mistaken to suggest that somehow health care reform is a problem vis-a-vis debt and deficit. It has to be paid for. In our budget, we pay for it. But over the longer term, one of the key outcomes of a health care reform that we're contemplating that helps to control costs is to actually bring debt and deficits down to a sustainable level moving forward.
But let me get to a point. Laura Tyson kind of raised the balloon of the possibility of a second stimulus bill. Now she says maybe not. But if it did so well for us so far, I mean, if we've benefited so much from the spending of this money, why not spend more? Why not bring in another stimulus plan?
Well, that's a little bit like after dinner last night. If I enjoyed that first bowl of ice cream, why don't I have 2 or 3 more? You know,
I do that.
Yeah, well, here you go. In the context of our conversation, debt, deficits, we have to balance stimulating the economy on one hand, fiscal rectitude on the other. We have to walk a line that gets the economy going through stimulus and pulls that stimulus back so we can do what you talked about in your very first question here. Get the temporary stimulus out of the system to bring the budget deficit down over our first term. So, you know, if we keep spending when we don't need to, that's not at all what this president is about. As far as the stimulus goes, we have to evaluate it. It's about a third obligated so far. We're about 160 days into a 2-year plan. It's much too early to contemplate a second stimulus. It looks like the first one, in tandem with our other plans, is taking hold in much the way we expected and hoped it to do.
Got it. All right. Hey, Jared, thanks so much. Jared Bernstein there, Chief Economist and Economic Policy Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden.